everybody, I'm Jackson Baly, and welcome to another episode of Jackson Baly's Spooks America. I'm Jackson Baly.
I'm Cass.
I'm Matt.
And I'm Adam.
And today we're going to be talking about, on Jackson Baly Spooks America, the Anjikuni Lake disappearance. Does that ring any bells for anybody here tonight?
The whole lake disappeared.
I knew this was going to be a problem because, I nearly called it the disappearance of Anjikuni Lake. I knew that was going to cause more problems. So I was like, I'll go for something safe, the Anjikuni Lake disappearance. No, the whole lake didn't disappear.
There's no name you could have chosen that didn't have the word disappearance and lake in it that we couldn't have subverted.
What if I'd called it the disappearance that happened at Anjikuni Lake?
Like all of what you just said?
That would have made sense. The disappearance that happened at Anjikuni Lake.
Yeah, but what? That's not a catchy title.
No, but I caught the concept of lakes vanishing, didn't I?
You did.
Nah, we would have asked what part disappeared, the lake or the Anjikuni.
There's no way I could have gotten away with it. So, it's the 1930s, Canada, Lake Anjikuni, or Anjikuni Lake.
It's a spooky time already, I think.
Yeah.
1930s.
It's frightening. To be on a lake in the snow in the 1930s.
1930s. They didn't even have colour TV back then.
It's eerie.
Yeah.
Everything was black and white.
So Anjikuni Lake, quite isolated, and a fur trapper named Joe LaBelle, he's making his way back to town after doing some furrying.
Joe LaBelle, by the way, is French for Joe the Bell.
Joe LaBelle.
I've dabbled a little bit.
He's coming back, and kind of the elements start to get to him. So he's like, well, I need to stop somewhere safe. And he knows that there's an Inuit village on the side of Anjikuni Lake that he can hide out in. The village has a population of around 30 to 40 people. He knows it's pretty lively. He'll be safe there. But when he arrives at this village on the edge of Anjikuni Lake, he finds it completely deserted. What do we think with that information? Where are we?
Could he have just gotten the location wrong?
No, so the village was a permanent settlement. There were,
could he be like, this is where the village is, but actually he thought he was one place, but he was somewhere else.
Okay, so he was at a separate abandoned village.
Oh, fuck, wait, there's a village here?
Yeah, it was a settlement. So he arrived to abandoned buildings and just not a soul inside. So this is a permanent settlement. With full-on structures, and he arrives and there's nobody there.
Did you say the date? Could it have been like some sort of a holiday?
Oh, I see. So a holiday, and everybody leaves the village and just goes off into the snow for. Well, if that is the case, then the other things that he found would make that even more mysterious. So he didn't see any smoke coming from any of the chimneys. So he was like, well, that's strange. It must be abandoned. But then he saw one chimney that was smoking. And when he arrived there, he saw that inside the house was a stew that had burned over and seemed to have been like the people making the stew seemed to stop in the middle of whatever they were cooking and have just left. So the people left suddenly is what it seems like.
Well, only one house is the only evidence for that.
Upon further investigation, he found that this was the case with a lot of places, and that the food and even weapons were left just exactly as they were in houses. Even in the middle of so there was what he said was a seal skin, which was in the middle of being de-skinned, or a seal that was in the middle of being de-skinned, which was with, I think, maybe it was in the middle of being sewn, because there was a needle in the skin when he found it. So it was
what an awful thing for the seal.
Oh, no.
That's rough.
You know?
Waiting there just to be like coming back. I'm getting in with my lack of skin. So, yeah, what do we think?
That's terrifying.
What makes a whole bunch of people, 30 to 40 people, leave a village all of a sudden?
It's not some sort of a threat. Otherwise, they would have taken their weapons.
Yeah, you would think so. You'd think if something had come to endanger them. And the weapons were left up against doors and up against houses. It wasn't like they'd taken their weapons and then been, kidnapped or whatever and dropped them. They were in the places that they would typically be. Right. Yeah. So I guess, not a threat. That's a good point to bring up. Yeah.
Whatever it was sudden, but not, it didn't require the use of a weapon, I guess. But it was so important that everyone in town was involved.
Yeah, so important that everybody left. But it's a weird knife's edge to walk where something is so intense that 30 to 40 people got to get up and go, but also not intense enough and leave in the middle of whatever they're doing that you pull up a weapon. I guess one possibility is it could have been like weather. If it's a blizzard that you're like, we can't survive this, you're not going to be like, I'll get my rifle and shoot the blizzard.
But you
Yeah.
also don't make that decision mid-stew.
Yeah, that's
Finish
true.
the stew.
No.
Let me just finish the stew.
You're going to want to eat, right?
Take it off the boil.
Yeah.
That makes sense. Although, you know that maybe one of them is somewhere away going, hang on a second. Got this awful feeling. I left my stew on. What was the name of this explorer guy?
He was Joe LaBelle.
That's right, the bell.
The bell. How could you
The
forget
bell.
the bell?
So potentially, the village hates Joe LaBelle.
They would
They
just
saw him
prank.
coming, and they're like, oh,
We better scarf.
let's get out of here.
Then this thing starts happening, and the entire town are like, well, if we keep up the ruse, he's not coming back.
It's so great to imagine that everybody that lived in the village was just hiding from like behind doors, being like, fuck, don't turn around,
Like
don't turn around.
the intro to Everyone Loves Raymond.
Yeah, he's coming. So, LaBelle, he's like, well, maybe they left. If they left, they had to, go further away from the village. So he starts to explore the outskirts, and he comes upon quite a grisly discovery.
Oh, no.
The sled dogs that belonged to this Inuit community were all dead on the edge of the village. Joe LaBelle figured, this is just his assumption, that they died of starvation. There were 7 to 8 sled dogs, and they were dead on the edge of the village.
7 to 8.
It's a lot of
Not-
sled dogs.
Yeah, but also not so many that he couldn't have been specific.
Yeah, that's true. 7 or 8,
I've
pick.
counted 7. There could have been another.
Surely, well, this timeline doesn't seem to fit that well, because if there was still a fire going enough that smoke was happening, there would not have been time for dogs to starve to death.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Especially when there's a perfectly good stew on the boil.
Well, that's another thing that a lot of the articles I was reading bring up. They're like, how did the dogs starve to death, given that all of the pantries and stuff was stocked, and all of the food in the community was still there, accessible to the dogs. There's one report one, I guess, sighting that says that the dogs were tethered to a scraggly bush, and that's why they couldn't leave. But that's only one report.
Scraggly
Every
bush.
other one. And a scraggly bush, I feel like you could get away from if you're a dog, if you're a husky.
If you cared enough.
Yeah.
I feel like husky dogs, so long as they weren't tied up, they could figure themselves. At least some of them would be able to figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely.
They would just become wild.
A husky dog, especially, but
Oh, yeah, your idea of figuring something out is becoming wild. I think I've figured this out.
Wait, I can just get my own food?
Let's do it.
If I needed to figure out how to get some food, I could get it out of you if I needed to.
that's true.
Oh,
I also
I
like-
do have a few snacks, yes.
I also like that
Milky Way bar.
it's kind of like the dogs have the well-stocked village or a caribou, and they're like, let's go wild. Let's take down this elk.
I have a theory.
Yeah?
There's a poison gas.
Uh-huh.
It comes in, takes the dogs out there, and everyone's like, oh my god, we gotta go, and they leave.
Ah, that's not a bad theory. So,
That's my theory.
that's a good one. Anybody else got a theory ATM at the moment? Where are we standing?
I was liking the idea of maybe it was some sort of like everyone had to go to church or something like that.
Yeah, okay.
And everyone left for, I don't know, some sort of service or ceremony or something maybe.
Okay, well, how did the dogs starve in that situation?
Well,
Why
yeah,
was it so
look.
sudden?
That was the ceremony. It was the dog killing ceremony.
Oh.
We got to get to church. Leave the stew. So, Joe LaBelle, he's like, this is pretty intense. This is a bit much for old Joe LaBelle. I've got to contact the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Mounties. And so Joe leaves back into the elements. He contacts the Mounties and he tells them, you got to launch an investigation. So they do. The Mounties are aware of, nearby to the village, there's another furrier who lives with his son in a kind of shack. So they go and they speak to them. Now, in the shack, the furrier and his son reluctantly, after some questioning, admit that they saw in the sky a silver object fly up from where the village was, which began shaped sort of like a cigar, then squished to the shape of a bullet and disappeared over onto the horizon. What are our thoughts about that?
Squished to the shape of
Yeah,
a bullet?
Yeah.
It's aliens. They know. Well, there's no mystery, is there? There's just no mystery.
The aliens took the people of Anjikuni village and killed the dogs. Yeah, so I think the way that they described it is that it was like a silver object in the sky that slowly transformed into the shape of more of a bullet and then disappeared over the horizon. Yeah. Does this change? Cass firmly in the area of aliens, landing on that theory. Matt,
Alien.
Adam?
There there wouldn't happen to be any transcript of that conversation.
No, there is not any transcript of that
There
conversation.
never is there?
Is that like because you've read a lot about this sort of stuff?
Yeah.
Is that a familiar description?
Well-
of a does it ring the bell?
Well, weirdly, the cigar shape, that's a really classic UFO shape. It's one of like the 3 classic UFO shapes of ball, cigar, or disc. But a bullet is rarer, and also one of them changing shape is rarer as well. If this is a UFO as typically described. Yeah, so it's a bit strange as a description. And like Adam says, there's no transcript that this conversation ever really took place. This is just what we're hearing. So Cass is on aliens. What about you guys? Discounting that, staying where you were previous?
It's hard to describe. It's hard to say what the object was that they saw, if not an alien.
Yeah.
Although whether or not they saw anything is, I don't know, up for debate.
Could have been
I
a
would
meteor, I suppose.
say. Didn't it rise up, they said?
Yeah, they said it came from the area of the village. But maybe if you're seeing it come from that horizon and go to the other horizon, you might be able to...
Oh, I see what you're saying.
maybe you could
So
mistake it.
Streaks all across
Yeah.
the sky.
Nevertheless, meteors don't tend to change shape in the sky. So,
Could have been tired.
they could
I
have
know
been
sometimes
sleepy.
I get sleepy. I don't want to put that on anyone else, you know?
Yeah.
I'm wondering if the villagers themselves were some sort of aliens.
Oh, I see. And they were like,
And
we
they-
got to get out of here.
They got their call away and had to go.
And they left the dogs, leave the stew. I guess if you get the call away, all of that stuff, whatever.
matter.
It's earthly
Yeah.
possessions.
Yeah.
You know, you're off.
You've got enough data now
Yeah.
from the lake. Now it's time to move on to another planet.
Well, look, good theory. So, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, when they arrived at the village, they discovered some disturbing things. They discovered that all of the graves in the village had been dug up and that there was no bodies to be found whatsoever.
That was the dogs, I reckon.
There is also an alternate telling of this that says that only one grave was dug up and that and there was no body in that, but the rest was still completely buried. And the tombstones or the grave markers were neatly stacked on either side of the graveyard or the cemetery area. What do we think?
Wait, so both versions had all
Both
the
versions have the stacked tombstones or grave markers, but one version tells of every single grave being exhumed and no bodies to be found, and the other just tells of one grave being exhumed and no bodies to be found.
Well, this goes to my alien theory. So
Yeah.
the aliens came and took the bodies of the dead.
Oh, that makes sense.
And sort of wore them as skin suits.
Oh, I see. That's not. I thought you were going to be like, well, if an alien dies,
Yeah.
you don't want to leave the alien body in the ground. You got to
Okay, no,
scalpel with that.
We gotta repatriate our alien bodies back to Exxon 3. Exxon, that's a company.
But I like, Matt, your idea that there was already a grave there, and they're like, we got to take our skin suits to go back for some reason.
Well, no, I mean, they did that when they arrived there.
Oh, that makes sense.
And they'd been wearing them the whole time, and it was only after they left that it was discovered
That
that
they'd
I'm not saying something crazy.
Well, what if there was a thing where they had to get the body of someone, and there was a race to get the body? So someone's gone and stacked all the graves up side by side, so you can't tell where the person's buried.
Oh, yeah.
And so when the stories are like, they dug one person up because they only wanted one person, and the story that's like they dug everyone up is because they were looking for one person.
Oh, so the other graves were disturbed,
Yeah.
but only one was properly exhumed. That's an
Or
interesting
the two
theory.
versions are because someone's trying to explain what happened.
Yeah, yeah.
And someone's like, they were after one body, one person got dug up, but everyone else they were looking and they were like, and they tried. But, it didn't
But
work.
those bodies weren't.
And that's
Yeah,
why all
yeah.
the grave markers were stacked there, like
We don't want people to know. Yeah, shuffle them like cards. So apparently, the ground around the graves was also described as being hard as rock. So the earth had become really solid for whatever reason.
clay.
Could just be cold.
Yeah, yeah,
It does
that's
tend
very
to do
possible
that.
as well.
Clay's hard to dig into.
Yeah. And as the Mounties left the village to return, they said that behind them an eerie glow emanated from the village as they made their way back to safety or town or whatever.
They probably just felt a bit spooked.
Could have also just been the Northern Lights. They're in Canada.
Yeah.
So with that, and then finally, the Mounties declared that they figured that the village had been abandoned. This is just based on their assumption for about 2 months.
Well, then, what's going on with that stew?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. This
That's the weirdest part of all
Yeah.
of this.
the stew's still
It should've
going.
burnt out, right? It should already.
Especially over 2 months. Like a stew will burn out over a day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Over 2 months, that stew is gone.
I forgot I had porridge on the stove the other day.
Yeah.
And that was only for like 10 minutes. And it turned into basically bread.
Yeah.
It was hardened around the bottom.
Oh, that's good.
Brown and hardened. And it just came out in one big piece.
I had stew for the first time like 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I didn't realize I'd never had stew. I thought it was like a soup, but it's
Yeah.
it's way thicker.
Yeah,
than that.
absolutely. It's nothing like a broth.
Yeah.
It's chunky, a stew.
I was
Stew.
shocked.
Nothing like a broth.
Well, maybe that's what happened. Maybe what they left was a broth. But because it was on the boil
Oh,
so
it's
long,
slowly
it was starting to become a stew.
Well, if you'll recall, in the studio house, we have gone through, I think, 3 saucepans of rice because 3 people have
Yeah.
subsequently left the rice on the stove over the course of, again, like a couple of hours, and it's burnt all the way down. Cass,
The
great
rice
face.
becomes one with the pan.
I don't know if I did 1 or 2 of those.
I think you did one, I think Adam did one, and I think Zamet did one as well. And each one resulted in a new saucepan that was subsequently ruined.
That's like the big 3 of Sans Pants, not Sans Jackson.
No, hey, that's what people consider. No, that's fair. The big 3. So what do we think? What's our theory currently?
Oh, sorry.
No,
Go on, please.
I just am trying to solve this stew conundrum.
Yeah.
So if this guy knew about the village and he was like, oh, I'm gonna just take refuge in this village. Clearly, there were nice enough people to let people in if they're like, hey, I'm not so good.
yeah.
So someone else has come in and been like, oh, no one's here. They probably wouldn't mind if I had a bit of a.
Oh,
snap.
yeah.
And then they heard this guy coming. They're like, oh, they're back and ran.
That's not a bad point. Although he did find other stews that had clearly been stopped in the middle, or like had clearly.
Okay, so there was one that was like.
One was still going, but the others had clearly, in the middle of making the stew, the person had
I
disappeared.
stand by my theory.
Yeah.
Makes it make sense in
I
my
actually
head.
think. Sorry. I think I've actually got my. Let me hit you with a theory, and that wouldn't actually. I think. So I independently had the same idea as Cass.
Yeah.
But I think Cass, our idea is still viable. Let me hit you.
Hit
with
me up.
this. All right.
Slam it, sock it to me.
So, what if there were supplies and personal effects and stuff like that still at town, but not all of the supplies and personal effects?
Okay.
So the town leaves in a hurry for whatever reason. They go, and then in the meantime, in that 2 months, another person comes to town and is trapped there briefly because their sled dogs die.
Ah.
They find one of those volcanic stews stuck to the edge
Yeah.
of the pot, and they're like, well, I've got to make do with
I gotta
what I've
eat.
got.
Yeah.
They heat that up and either have some or don't have some, whatever. And then at some point in the meantime, they leave. Then this guy comes along.
The bell, yeah. No, that's not a bad theory. Doesn't even have to be, if you've arrived in a village like this, you're starving, you're freezing. According to LaBelle, the pantries or whatever was well stocked, so you just make your own
Just eat,
stew.
yeah.
I was also, sorry, what I was thinking as well is if the town had like some sort of mass exodus, if it was kind of semi-planned and there was an idea that they would be maybe like building the village somewhere else for some reason or something like that, they might be like, well, we don't want to leave grandma and grandpa here. Let's take them with us as well and rebury them.
Yeah. Oh, okay. Like if you're like we are permanently resettling
Yeah.
somewhere, you're not. You might be. Like it's sort of like maybe a sacred thing or like a religious thing to live near your dead. So yeah, you might pick them up and take them. What an eerie like sled dog chain.
And that might be why they couldn't have taken all of their stuff.
Yeah. No, that's not a bad
Too many
theory.
corpses.
Too many corpses.
Yeah.
Age-old problem when packing. The trick is roll them up.
Get them like 2 socks and put them into each other.
I've heard a good like idea typically is to put them in one of those bags and then vacuum them.
Yeah, no, that's
Save
clever.
space.
No, you want to do that fun trick where you get, your your aunt and your uncle and you roll them into each other and you roll them up inside grandma. You slide mum and dad around the outside.
I saw this great video the other day of how to properly fold a dead grandma. You're supposed to like lie on them, grab each of their limbs or whatever, and then you fold up with them. It's just like how they come in the package. That's how they do it to get them.
Amazing.
Well, that's exciting.
Yeah, they end up looping together, don't they?
Yeah.
And you can zip them up in a circle bag.
Looping at the hips, that's great.
I wanted to buy one of those the parental folders.
Yeah.
You know, like they seem expensive, but you know that's what they use in the shops. You just whack, and then you can stack them on the shelves.
Imagine coming across an abandoned sleeping bag, opening it up, and a dead body comes out.
How did it all fit in there?
So, there are a couple of holes in LaBelle's story.
They Marie Kondoed the graveyard. Sorry.
This does not spark joy. Dig him up. It's great in the one grave exhumed because they're like, everything's good except this one guy. Let's throw him
The
out.
first hole in his story is town was inhabited.
No, so, at the time of the year that he claimed this happened, the lake should have been frozen. But LaBelle describes canoes in the water smacking against each other, being knocked by waves. Also, this particular area was not this community was not a seal hunting community. They were a caribou hunting community. And so if LaBelle was as good a hunter or as good a fur trapper as he claims, then he would be able to tell the difference between a seal skin and a caribou skin. But he claimed that there were only seal in the village, but it's a caribou hunting village. So
that feels like a big difference. Caribou is like a big...
It's like a
bull,
deer.
right? Or deer, right.
Yeah.
That's quite different.
Yeah.
Seal.
It's got fur.
And legs.
also,
Seal have fur.
yeah.
Oh, do they?
Yeah,
Oh,
sort
I
of.
didn't know. Oh, well, see, I wouldn't be able to tell the difference. I think we've just proven that maybe someone could get confused. If I can get confused, then any reasonable, handsome person can become confused.
Also, the Royal Canadian Mabian police,
Yes.
they denied ever having any investigation into this particular case. And according to most people, the first instance we find of this story at all is from a 1959 UFO book, okay, which claims to be a transcript of a 1930s newspaper article by a fella by the name of Emmett Kelleher. So most people claim, well, this is bupkis, this is bullshit, because the Canadian police they deny it, and it seems like it comes from a fantasy book, basically.
Sounds to me like the Canadian police were involved.
Oh, okay.
Trying to cover it up.
Yeah.
Well,
But if the Canadian police were involved, then how did we hear anything about what the Canadian police did?
well, in the story told in the UFO book, they describe the Canadian Mounted Police's expedition into the village.
Yeah.
But
But who were they getting that information from?
Well-
Maybe there's a mole inside the Mounties. A Mountie mole.
according to the 1930s article that the 1959 book is describing, the author of the article was a sort of like a investigative journalist who was chatting to LaBelle and the Canadian Mounted Police and had summed up exactly what happened from this journalist's investigations. Also, no inhabited community was ever really found on the side of the lake.
Wait, didn't you say they were a caribou hunting community?
Well, this is where it gets complicated. So before I get into anything else, what are we thinking? There are a lot of holes in the story. A lot of things don't make sense.
I think I need a clarification really quickly. Wait a minute. So the Bell
Yeah, thank you.
claims that they were a seal hunting community.
Yes.
Who said they were actually caribou? Sorry, hunting community. I know they weren't caribou.
So even though the Royal Canadian Mounted Police deny that any of this ever happened, a article from, I forget when, but by Fate magazine, was where people went kind of on a deep dive and investigated archives, found 2 investigations that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police have actually legitimately done on this case. These happened in 1931, a year after Kelleher and LaBelle said that all of this happened. So
They lied.
But you also said it was fake magazine. So I feel like there's a
Fate with a T. Fake magazine. The magazine of lies. So there were actually 2 investigations done by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And it's from that we learned that it was a caribou hunting community and not a seal hunting community.
So wait, has anyone? Is there like an actual document from the Royal Canadian Royal Canadian Mounted Police
Yes.
about that. Has anyone told the Royal Canadian Mounted Police that there is in fact documentation?
Well, I don't know if anybody's done a full-on Royal Canadian Mounted Police were taking you to court for lying about this never happening, because I don't think they were officially like, we are making an official statement, we never went and investigated. I think just when questioned, they were like, no, we don't know what you're talking about. So it's far less official than any of that makes it sound, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
We don't know what we're... Wink! So what do we think? What's our current thought process?
Oh, my current thought is confusion.
Yeah.
There's a lot going on.
There is a lot to take in, that's
Gave
fair.
us a lot of information and then took a lot of it away.
Yeah.
I think
that one about it being fake does seem like it trumps all other stuff.
That's fair. So, there are a couple of things about it that are definitely true. LaBelle does exist. He was a fur trapper. He was a genuine guy. And even though, so Skeptoid, which I think is a website, they did an investigation on this and they were like, we can't find any evidence that any of this happened. But then they updated and they were like, actually, in our investigation, we did find the 1930s newspaper article that the science fiction magazine was purporting to talk about. That was a genuine article by Robert Kelleher. Emmett Kelleher. So, but the actual story is far more subdued. The village is given as being a lot smaller. There's no mention of any of the exhumed graveyards, and the amount of dogs dead is also much smaller. But the story, other than that, remains
Smaller
roughly
than
the same.
7 or 8.
Yeah, about maybe 4 or 5.
Well, that demystifies a lot. It feels like something like a migration is a lot more likely now.
Yeah.
Okay, so the 2 investigations that the Royal Canadian Mounted Police did. The first one was semi-official. It was done by a guy named Jay Nelson. And it largely consisted of kind of just going and interviewing people around Lake Anjikuni there. And most of it seemed like he was just talking to one lady who worked at a shop, which is kind of what makes it sort of unofficial. And she was like, oh, that Joe LaBelle, he was a fur trapper, but he was really new in the territory. He wouldn't know what he was talking about. He was a big idiot. He loves lying. And also, Jay Nelson was like, oh, that Kelleher who wrote that article, he loves telling lies. And they were like, have you ever met him or interviewed him? He's like, no, but I will one day. So Jay Nelson, it seems like he has a lot of evidence against this story ever being true, but also it seems like he investigated it really poorly.
Yeah, I trust Shopwoman.
Yeah, so the other investigation, this was a more official one.
Yeah.
They did find an abandoned village, but again, it was much smaller, like Kelleher said. And they also found that it was what they described as a seasonal village. So it was a village that people spend some time at, and then they leave, and then they come back.
You should have just is there a mystery here? It really doesn't sound like there's a mystery.
Well, they never returned. And there are the Anjikuni people, they've never been found again. So something happened.
Is this someone going into a community that they don't understand but assume to know? And making a lot of assumptions based on their own culture and community.
Is this an indigenous community?
Yeah, they're Inuit.
Yeah, do you think it's potentially possible that in the 1930s, no one really cared to check where indigenous people were?
Nevertheless, if the community can't be found today, the village is gone.
Maybe they got integrated into another community.
No, that's very possible. So what's our theory? Where are we currently sitting?
If it was no. The village moved. Oh my god, this seems so open and shut.
The sled dogs.
I think they were aliens.
Okay, that's good to hear.
It also seems open and shut for you.
The sled dogs, there were some still found dead, and the stews and stuff, the food was still in a state of like sudden leaving. It seems like whatever happened occurred very quickly. So there was still some, and they never found the Anjikuni people ever again. So wherever they left to, they never returned. And you would think that even though it was the 1930s, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police would have done some investigating on that front. If they were like, oh, it is a seasonal village, they would be like, well, let's go find out where they went.
Unless they really didn't care.
Yeah.
Well, that's possible as well.
I reckon a change in weather happened, and they were like, oh, the season's now, and left.
Okay, where do you think they went?
Well, if everyone that they were... If the people, so this investigator, if he was like, hey, I know that if I go in there, they will just accept me being there.
Yeah.
It seems like they were very community focused. So maybe they just, found someone else.
Yeah,
Like
okay.
they got message from another community nearish to them that were
Another
like,
community, aka their home planet.
And they left in a big UFO that became a bullet.
yeah.
So what about you, Matt? Where are you still sitting on the alien front? Is that where you're kind of
that's-
sitting?
That's just what makes more sense to me.
I did forget about
Explain
this
the bullet.
Yeah,
Explain the bullet in
you
the
can't. They
sky.
didn't have guns in that time. So
That's true. So what are the elements of this that we believe to be true and the elements of it that we believe are fake? Because I think the exhumed bodies, even if the community is migrating somewhere else, is not that hard to assume like as being a legitimate part of it.
Yeah.
That's another weird thing, though, as well, if you assume that element is fake, that they never came back to, even if they'd integrated with another community, never coming back to your ancestors seems like a strange move.
I won't.
I rarely visit my ancestors' graves.
Yeah.
That's fair.
On occasion, but when I do, it's not necessarily documented by history.
I could imagine both sides. I could imagine leaving bodies there. I could imagine, especially if it's like a seasonal village, there might not be that many graves there.
Yeah, that's possible.
I could imagine leaving the graves there and never coming back because you maybe have no connection. Maybe you're like, their spirit is with me.
Yeah.
Or I could also imagine exhuming the bodies and bringing them with you to bury them somewhere else. Either way, it doesn't seem that suspicious to me.
Yeah,
Does
that's
that make
fair.
sense?
Also, like, that could have been another thing where they're like, oh, we'll just, it's not a graveyard anymore. We'll put all the stones in and the bodies can fertilize the earth. The earth's a bit hard.
Yeah, that's true. That
like,
brings
it's
in the
technically
hard earth
not a
element
grave
of the
anymore.
story.
We can leave.
Yeah.
We'll come back and we'll farm on it later.
Yes. Well, possibly. So we sitting on just that it was Joe LaBelle, sequence of events is Joe LaBelle walks in. Joe LaBelle, I think the fact that the shopkeeper lady was like, he doesn't know what he's talking about.
I love her.
I think it explains away the like, he should have known it was a seal and not a caribou.
You should have known it was a seasonal village.
Yeah, well, that's true.
He should have known anything. Why was he there? Did he get lost, did you say?
Yeah, well, I think as he was coming home, the elements sort of changed, and he's like, "Oh, I need somewhere to hide out. Oh, I know these guys; they're friendly. They'll take me in."
The stew is a big part of it, right?
Yeah.
Take that out, and you.
The stew is one of the big kind of like, because I agree. I think largely what's likely, I suppose, is that the Anjikuni people, they leave their village to go to wherever greener pastures and then something happens while they're away and they never return, or they integrate into another First Nations community,
Maybe
or
some sort of like agreement is struck with the government where they're given other lands that they prefer or something like that, whatever.
yeah, and then that's kind of, sort of that, and they don't return for whatever reason, and it becomes this big sort of conspiracy. But it seems weird for it to happen as suddenly as it seems to have happened.
And they didn't take that much stuff.
Yeah, well, there was still a lot of things left
You
at the
think
village.
you take your weapons.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you would think you would take your rifles and stuff. And a lot of people were like, such a like a lot of people who were talking about the mystery or whatever were like, it was such an integral part to the lifestyle of the people living here because they were hunting caribou and because they were using weapons. They were using guns. So it's strange for them to leave that kind of stuff
Unless
behind.
they think they're coming back.
Yes, that's true. But even if you think you're coming back, if you're moving to different pastures, presumably you're moving to different pastures to do what you were already doing.
Yeah.
Not if it's a seasonal village.
Yeah, that's.
You're moving because the seasons mean something else. You're changing your
So
lifestyle.
I suppose something like previously when you're in Anjikuni Lake, you're hunting caribou.
But when you're at somewhere else, maybe you're farming.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah.
Going back to reap what you've sowed,
Yeah, I suppose so. Although,
so to
yeah.
speak, literally.
Oh!
I think there's also a very large possibility that a lot of this is all a lie. And that's always an option here in Jackson Baly Spooks America. Sometimes we forget, but it could all be completely made up. The reason for this is that even though Fate magazine, and I think this article about the two Royal Canadian Mounted
Are you
Police,
saying the Fate magazine, that famous and very reputable publication,
Yeah.
could have made something
I
up?
think it's become less reputable with time. I think back,
That's
I know.
so impressive.
I think early on, back in the day, they were properly investigating things like this. But whether or not any of that stuff that they found is legitimate or just lies, like it's a secondary source again. So we don't know if that ever existed. And because the village, we can't find it anymore, there's just a possibility that none of this happened.
What do you use as your secondary source? I like a honey mustard.
What's your primary?
Right, tomato.
Yeah.
Tomato and honey mustard. That's a weird mix.
Not if you're having chips.
Barbecue and honey mustard.
Are you talking about like some sort of a burger or a
Yeah.
sausage?
Tomato.
That's a pretty
I don't
classic
think you go tomato
cheese
and
and
honey.
onion.
You just go honey and tomato and American mustard.
Yes,
It's
yeah.
a classic combo because tomato sauce is already quite sweet.
Honey mustard's really sweet to combine with.
I'm with you, buddy.
Yeah.
They're talking nonsense.
Sound off in the
'cause
comments.
They don't understand that I'm balancing it with a very gritty bun.
I'm not balancing it. I'm just.
All right.
He got us there. He got us there.
Gritty.
Bun of grits.
There's so many grains. It is, there's no softness at all. It hurts to eat it.
That's
Gravel.
intense. It is funny that with this mystery, really, at the end of the day, assuming that any of it did happen, the stew is. It's like the little rock in your shoe.
Yeah.
Because if the stew doesn't exist, if nobody's got a stew going, perfect sense. You leave your stuff there because say you're going to reap a farmland that you've previously established, and after that you intend to come back and do more hunting. So you're like, well, whatever. But if you've left a stew, that implies really sudden movement. I also can't explain the starved dogs unless you assumed possibly that you were coming back in a month, and you came back a lot later than you expected.
Right, yeah, you left them a month's
But
worth
even
of
then,
power.
it seems like you would bring your dogs. I mean, I don't know, but it just seems like
Maybe
that would
they
be the
brought most of their dogs.
They did leave a small number. It seems like you would bring your dogs, and I know we're saying you wouldn't be hunting in wherever you were going, but it feels like a weapon, like a gun. It's
They
such
could
a
have brought some, like the bell.
Yeah.
He doesn't know if everything is there.
That's
Yeah.
true.
Doesn't know if every single gun is still accounted for.
Yeah, I
he doesn't know
suppose.
if every equipment is accounted for.
They've got one of those chalk outline boards where their guns are. And they're all
You just
full.
see what's missing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I wonder if it was even a shorter trip they were thinking to take, because it does, like, you can't leave a month's worth of food for dogs. can
No,
you?
no,
You
no.
could leave maybe a day or two.
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
It was a long weekend.
And even though we're saying you maybe didn't take all the guns, I feel like guns were just such a valuable commodity. And if you knew people like LaBelle were coming through, you would probably just be
Yeah.
like, I just want to keep it with me. Like, why not keep it with
I
me?
don't know. I think the opposite. I think with like an isolated mountain community like that, you might be like, who is going to be wandering in?
Back in the 30s, you didn't used to lock your doors.
That's true. You can just leave your guns out on the porch. Yeah, but even if it is, like you're saying, Matt, like a shorter trip planned, you probably wouldn't take everyone in the village. Yeah,
But maybe that only half the village went. When they didn't come back, the others went out to search.
Oh
for
yeah,
them.
that's possible. That's possible. Still seems like a great many people, but
Yeah.
And then
And
when
also
they
the
didn't come back,
stew.
the others
more
went.
people left, and the stew.
We keep forgetting that this town is not being described as, or like, the Bell is describing this as a big town, but everyone else is like, it was pretty small.
Yeah, that's true. I
It
suppose
was one hut. A family of four.
was a single house.
Well, actually, if it's one hut, that becomes more baffling because then they definitely, if there is any guns there, they did not take their guns.
Yeah. So what do we think? Can I get ultimate theories from the three of you?
I think it was a seasonal village. I think they left and they've moved on somewhere else.
Okay.
I agree with the whole seasonal thing, but I think they were aliens.
Yeah.
So-
Good. I'm glad you're still on the alien
So
front.
this was just their alien seasonal hangout, and they went to a different planet for the winter or whatever. And yeah, something happened over there, and they never came back.
That's great. It's great to imagine that they're like, well, we'll come back for the Huskies. We're going to Mars, but we'll be back for the Huskies.
Time's different in space.
They were like, these are caribou?
Oh my God, we've been
We've been
hunting.
killing dogs.
We've been killing dogs the only way we know how, starving them out and eating them.
The edge of town.
What do you think, Cass?
I'm back around to poison gas.
Yeah, all right.
Everyone was getting ready, and then the poison gas came through. They're like, "Oh my god, the dogs! We gotta go now."
I'm kind of not against like the blizzard theory.
Yeah, or like poison from the weather.
Yeah. The weather's greatest poison, the
Yes.
wind.
They killed the dogs off real fast, and they're like, "We need to leave immediately."
That's a good point. So you say that they starved to death, but
Yeah.
are they just assuming that because they were...
I
with
assume
no
so. That was
wounds?
what LaBelle said.
So that could have been a poison gas if he did do an autopsy on them.
Yeah, well, what about this as a sort of theory? So LaBelle is approaching this village because he is, the weather is changing. But possibly the Inuits living in the village also noticed that the weather was changing, and they were like, we got to hightail it to somewhere safer.
Yeah.
So they leave. LaBelle comes in and he sees, wow, the village is eerily quiet, and also everybody's left very suddenly. Maybe he hangs out in the village where, sometimes that's the kind of thing that happens. People are like, we need to get somewhere safer, but actually it would have been safer where they started. They leave wherever the Anjikuni people have gone. They've suffered the damage of the weather, and they've frozen to death in the wastes somewhere out in the Canadian wilderness.
I feel like that would be something people figured out though. If there was such a blizzard or something, maybe poison gas. I don't know. I don't know how localized the poison gas can be, but blizzards are pretty big.
That's true. It also could be a temperature thing. If this is the time of year where, sometimes you get sort of sudden drops and they're like, this is coming, we got to go. It just seems like, to me, that explains the village being almost like people left, 10 minutes ago, more than everybody leaving because of a seasonal change. Yeah. And then he comes in and he's like, something's amiss. He goes back. The Canadian Mounties come in. They're like, oh, the dogs have starved to death. Something mysterious has happened here, when actually it was just the changing weather. But still, a lot of it, I think this is one of those mysteries where ultimately I'm going to settle on lie for the whole thing. I don't think any of it happened. I think that you can speculate as much as you like, but I think unless we get like a deep dive documentary done in this day and age where somebody tracks down every single source, I don't think we're ever going to get any confirmation of any of it. And I have to assume that any of the fantastical elements like the dug up graves and the hard ground and maybe even the dead dogs were just additions, added later to this story. So yeah, that's kind of where I'm settling.
Yeah.
All
I
right.
didn't realize you wanted genuine answers.
No,
In that
Hey,
case,
that's
I'm going
good.
to change my answer to
Yeah.
a smoky tomato chutney
Great choice.
Ah.
Great choice.
with
Yes.
a seeded mustard.
No, that makes
No,
perfect
that's
sense.
perfect,
Yeah.
yeah.
That makes perfect sense. There aren't enough chutneys on burgers these days.
No.
It's a real problem. I love a chutney and I love a relish, also good. Don't know the difference? Like them both.
Relishes are green, chutneys are red. That's the
Nope.
difference.
I think it's a consistency thing, but
No,
I don't know
I'm
for
pretty
sure.
It's the color.
Well, look, yeah, it's one of those mysteries that I think we're never going to solve unless somebody does a proper look into it, but I think it's very interesting. And on that note, I've been Jackson Baly.
I've been Cass.
I've been Matt.
I've been Adam.
Get spooked, America. Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Happy Halloween!
Happy Halloween!
Woo!